Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Our Future is Green. We have a panel of speakers tonight. Paula Garcia is an energy analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Jennie Stephens is a professor of sustainability and science at Northeastern University. And Larry Chretien is the executive director of Green Energy Consumers. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speakers will each do a 10 to 15 minute presentation and then they'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time and then I'll read them at the end of all the presentations. Paula Garcia will be our first speaker and we'll talk about the new Massachusetts climate law. Over to you, Paula.
Perfect. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. I'm Paula Garcia. I am a senior bilingual energy analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Basically, my work is focused on research and analysis of energy and climate solutions on the electricity sector with the intention to address the climate crisis and to make sure that the benefits of a clean energy transition reach everyone in our society. I live in Waltham, so I'm very thankful for this invite to present tonight. And I am originally from Colombia. So in terms of the Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS, the organization was created more than 50 years ago by scientists and students from MIT. And the idea was to make sure that science was going to be used to inform policy making, and especially to inform and address environmental and social problems. So at the beginning, the organization was focused mostly on nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Since then we've been growing. And now we are working in more areas, including clean transportation, food and environment, the defense of our democracy, and climate and energy. So for tonight, I'm going to be touching on two key points. One is the basics of climate change, and the other thing is what Massachusetts is doing specifically around a new climate law that was recently enacted. So, in terms of climate change, it is warming. Climate change is one of the most devastating problems that humanity has ever faced. And we are running out of time. Scientists have taken detailed measurements of carbon dioxide levels since the late 1950s. And what they have found is that carbon dioxide levels are higher today than at any point, at least in the last 800,000 years. As the amount of carbon dioxide increases, the planet warms up. Sea level rise, extreme weather becomes more commonplace, and a whole range of impacts, including wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, droughts, all those things are more likely to happen and more severe. The other thing that we know is that it is us. So you can see in the graph right now what's the observed difference in temperature from average. What comes from natural drivers is the blue line, and what comes from human drivers. So for over 200 years, humanity has powered itself with fossil fuels like oil, like coal, and like gas. We've seen an enormous amount of development and progress, and also all of this has come at an incredible cost. The cars we drive, the fuel we burn for electricity and warmth, the food we eat or waste, and the forests we clear are the causes. When we burn fossil fuels, these fossil fuels release carbon dioxide, and this acts as a blanket around the earth. As the amount of carbon dioxide increases, the planet warms up. And we are sure about this. As we can see in the graph, we are not going in the right direction also. Scientists have studied global warming for more than 100 years. Thousands of experts have done studies on this. Thousands of papers have been written every year, including by Harvard, NASA, the US Department of Defense, and the consensus couldn't be clearer. Climate change is happening, and it is caused primarily by the burning of oil, gas, and coal. At the present rate that we are going, global temperatures will increase, as we can see in the graph, 1.5 degrees by 2040 and 2 degrees by 2060. So to address this situation in 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement set a goal to limit the increasing global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and that further efforts were encouraged to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. As of February of this year, more than 190 countries have signed the agreement. Unfortunately, reality is showing us that we are not on track, and we are not headed to cooler years. We're headed toward a warmer world. In fact, a 2020 report from the United Nations Environment Program shows that temperatures will likely rise in excess of 3 degrees this century if we fail to sharply curtail emissions. Here in Massachusetts, that will expose us to more extreme sea level rise and extreme heat, among other great impacts. So we can and should fix it. So there are two things that we can and should be doing. We should be working on adaptation. This is how can we adapt to the current conditions so that we can keep people safe in the immediate. And the other front in which we should be working is mitigation. This is how can we reduce emissions to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So I will then focus on what Massachusetts is doing around this, how Massachusetts is addressing climate change. Last month marked a major milestone for equitable climate policy. After years of efforts and following 2 vetoes by Governor Charlie Baker, the legislature passed a long-awaited bill. And the difference this time is that Governor Baker signed it into law on March 26th. So I'm going to share 3 key components from this new law. There are many other key great provisions in the law, but I will focus on 3 that I find particularly important. The first one is that it sets a clear vision and trajectory to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to address climate change. So the state is now required to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, which is aligned with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. It also requires at least 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and 75% by 2040. So this is like by 2050 net zero, and how we're going to be getting there includes targets for 2030 and 2040. The law also requires clear sector-specific targets for each of these interim targets. And when I'm talking about clear sector-specific targets, I'm talking about sectors like electricity, transportation, commercial and industrial buildings, residential buildings, industrial processes, and natural gas distribution. This is great because what it's showing us is that the state understands that to fight the climate crisis, we need all hands on deck. Other key provision from this new law is that it provides enforceable tools to protect the health of environmental justice communities. So socioeconomic and environmental inequities have systemically affected a disproportionate number of Black, Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, and low-income communities. These inequities, including a harmful exposure to particulate matter pollution, have only elevated the risk to getting infected and dying from COVID. We need to make sure that in the name of climate action, we are not perpetuating these inequities. So the law is providing enforceable protections to environmental justice communities, including that it codifies into law what constitutes an environmental justice communities. And it requires the assessments of cumulative impacts of projects proposed in or near environmental justice communities to protect particular neighborhoods from projects that will exacerbate even more industrial and environmental burdens. Other key provision from this new law is that it boosts clean energy and clean transportation, which are key components of an energy transition. For the electricity sector, for instance, utilities are now being required to meet at least 40% of their customer needs with renewable energy by the year 2030. It also increases the offshore wind target from 3,200 megawatts to 5,600 megawatts. And you may think like, so what's that? Basically, what we have is that amount of offshore wind energy will be able to meet close to half of Massachusetts' electricity needs. Another key component is the transportation sector, because it's very important to recognize that the transportation sector is the only sector in Massachusetts where emissions are higher today than what they were in 1990. So the law seeks to start addressing this situation by setting targets to increase the adoption of electric vehicles and charging stations. As with any new law, there is still much more work ahead of us, because we need to focus on how to implement the law, and we also need to be thinking about how to continue on advancing a vibrant and equitable clean energy economy. And right now, there are different bills in this current legislative session that will be important for building on this foundation. All that is great because we cannot afford to stop here. For today, I invite us all to celebrate this new climate law, and I also want to remind us that there is still much more work ahead of us. And as I said before, we need all hands on deck. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula. So I'll just go ahead then. And so Paula gave details about state policy, and what I can do is kind of broaden that a little bit and give a context of national as well as, and then I think Larry's going to come back and talk local as well, so we can connect the dots here. So I'm going to talk about the Green New Deal, which is an exciting set framework that is not only, most of us have been thinking about it, and it became most politicized at the national level with the introduction in 2019 by Senator Markey and AOC, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in response to the Sunrise Movement's advocacy to really push for a different kind of climate policy. And I call this a different kind of climate policy because it's about investing in people and in communities and infrastructure and jobs. Previously, our climate policies, a lot of them were about taxing things, right? Either carbon tax or thinking about other kinds of incentives. But this is different. It's kind of a different approach, which is it's exciting because it offers a different way of connecting climate to everything else, which people are worried about, more so potentially than climate. So now I'm just trying to advance my, there we go. So it's really about resisting the economic precarity that so many people are in, reclaiming the power of public investment and really saying, we can actually invest in and not worry about how many $1 trillion it will cost, right? Because it's going to be actually more cost effective to make these investments, even though it has a high price tag, than not, because of the devastation and suffering associated with climate. And then it's about restructuring society and thinking about a more inclusive prosperity. And with that, I want to acknowledge that one of the challenges that we have with the climate crisis is this growing economic injustice with increasing share of national income and wealth, this widening income and wealth gap with concentration of wealth and power among a very few. People don't always think about this related to climate, but it actually is, because the top 1% and the people who are profiting from the current system actually don't want the changes that we need. And they've been strategically investing to resist the renewable transformation and resist investing in people and communities and households and what people need and public health and jobs. And so what we really need, this is unsustainable. Like if you look at these, we don't want it to keep getting worse and worse. So we need a bigger change. And that's kind of what the Green New Deal framework provides in terms of policy framework. I mentioned this, one of the things I have really acknowledged, and I recently wrote this book called Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And I credit this new leadership that is not focused on concentrating wealth and power, but the opposite, distributing wealth and power, that is represented by the Squad and many others, really as an opening to for the Green New Deal, for this different kind of climate policy that leverages the transformative changes that are needed by linking climate with other problems and connecting it with reducing inequities and disparities by centering economic justice, social justice, and racial justice. So with some students of mine at Northeastern, we actually have done an analysis of Green New Deal policies, and it's not just the national level policy that has been proposed, but there's a whole host of other Green New Deal policies. We have here in Boston, Michelle Wu, one of the candidates for mayor, has come up with a Green New Deal for Boston. And so what this figure just shows is how Green New Deal like policies are just a different approach than both business as usual, which is having no climate policy, just assuming we're going to continue with the inequities and the fossil fuel reliance and expensive climate and health catastrophes and climate displacement, or the more traditional climate policies, which have been, as I mentioned before, kind of focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions through different mechanisms, including potentially carbon tax or other kinds of regulatory measures that have been kind of incremental, or the Green New Deal policies, which is this different kind of approach, which is focused on equity and health and environmental and labor justice, as well as the zero emission energy, as well as minimizing climate displacement and catastrophes. So we looked at a whole bunch of different climate Green New Deal like proposals. And it was February 2019 where the HR 109 was introduced. That was the first Green New Deal proposal. And then California proposed one. Then when Bernie Sanders, running for president, his campaign proposed their own Green New Deal. Then there was in January 2020, the Red Deal, which is a indigenous focused proposal. And then there's been a whole host of other ones that are, including the Biden plan. We include the Biden plan in our analysis. They don't use the words Green New Deal because it's been so politicized, but it's a Green New Deal-like plan in that it's about investing, big, massive amounts of investing and connecting the renewable energy transition with jobs and economic investments. So here you can see there's also the Next Generation EU has a multinational Green New Deal plan. We have indigenous plans that have been proposed that are Green New Deal like, people's orientation to a regenerative economy and the Red Deal. Then we have the national level. Canada has a Pact for a Green New Deal proposal. Then we have HR 109, which is the main one that has been politicized and talked about. The Thrive Agenda, which is also a Green New Deal-like plan, and then regional, state, and municipal, as I mentioned, the Boston Green New Deal, as well as state level ones. So what we did in our analysis was actually look to see how much detail is in these plans. And what we found is that the people who developed plans that are running for office have a lot of detail. Whereas the other plans are, including the HR 109, the original plan from February 2019, is actually more of a framework without a lot of detail. Not surprisingly, Michelle Wu's plan for Boston Green New Deal is full of detail. The Biden plan was also full of detail, and Bernie Sanders' plan, Green New Deal plan, was also full of more detail. So that's an interesting thing to think about. So the arguments for Green New Deal are relating to the climate and energy, to equity and environmental justice, to human and environmental health, and then also to jobs and economic and just the idea of a just transition and providing access to dignified, well-paying work for everybody. So I can end there and just mention again my book that I recently published last year, which just kind of brings together these ideas that we actually need to invest, and that the climate crisis is an opportunity for us to restructure society and think about these issues in a different way and move beyond kind of the simplistic or narrow way of just thinking about greenhouse gas emission reductions or decarbonization, which those are really important. But then if we just stay focused on just those quantitative measures and not think about the social and the social justice implications of what we're doing, we're not going to be as inclusive, we're not going to get the buy-in that we need, and we also are not going to be as transformative as what's needed. So I will end there and look forward to the discussion.
Hi, everybody. My name is Larry Chretien. I'm the Executive Director of the Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're a nonprofit organization based in Boston, in Jamaica Plain, and also in Providence, Rhode Island. We've been around a long time, since 1982. We have a mission to make energy more affordable and sustainable. Particularly, we want to speed the transition. We're all about speeding the transition that's happening to a low carbon future. Every time we think of an energy issue, we think about how we can affect it. Sometimes we want to affect it by offering a program that consumers can tap into. And sometimes we affect the issue by advocating for better policy. Primarily, we work at the state and local level. And you can go to our website, greenenergyconsumersalliance.org, and you can learn more about us there, about the different programs we have. Trying to advance here. Okay, here we go. So what we're talking about with greening the electricity grid, and both Paula and Jenny talked about this a bit, is we essentially, the transition is going from, not too long ago, we had very dirty electricity, almost all fossil fuels and nuclear power and other things that were emitted into the atmosphere. We've gotten a bit cleaner, but we have to get over to the right, which is essentially 100% renewable energy, zero emission resources. And that is what our organization is all about and what I think the actions at the federal and state level are all about. Here, what I'm showing you is an example of what the typical electricity customer in Massachusetts would receive. There's a list of resources, and the ones that are in bold, if you add up all the zero emission resources, there are more zero emission resources than you might think. Lots of hydro and from Canada, small resources. Nuclear power, whether you like it or not, is a zero emission resource, and increasing amounts of solar and wind. And so the grid's cleaner than people think. And that's important as we think about trying to shift people out of gasoline powered cars to electric cars, or out of heating systems that use oil or gas and onto heat pumps. So just remember, a little more than half is already zero emission resources. Then there's about 5% of the mix. These are rough numbers. They are renewable resources, but they have some emissions with them. It's different forms of biomass, things like municipal trash and whatnot. But the key point is this 40% of the mix is still oil, coal, or natural gas. In Massachusetts, we've pretty much gotten coal and oil out, except for the very coldest days of the year. But we are very reliant on natural gas. And this is on an annual basis, not necessarily on a given day. And so in order to get to the zero emissions, we've got to squeeze out at least 40% of what we've got now. So as Paula mentioned, we've got some good things happening in Massachusetts that thanks to the new law that passed, but also as a result of previous laws like the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Green Communities Act. And so even before the law was passed that Paula referred to, by 2024-ish, we'll get about another 20% of our power will come from Canadian hydropower. A lot of people aren't crazy about having a contract for a lot of power from Hydro-Quebec, but that's already been approved. It's been by the state legislature and by the Mass Department of Public Utilities. The utilities have contracts for it. And so that 20% is going to come on by 2024. Shortly thereafter, probably 2025 and 2026, we have two major offshore wind projects that'll bring in another roughly 14% of our power from offshore wind projects. It'll create a lot of jobs in Massachusetts. And every day we're adding more and more solar energy as a result of the laws that have been passed. And so we still need to go beyond those things. Paula mentioned that the new law does authorize the purchase of more offshore wind power, and we think that's great. We were advocates for the bill as well. But the point is, the grid is already getting cleaner than many people think. So here's a graph that shows that according to, we have a law called the Clean Energy Standard, and another one that's related to it, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And this graph shows the emissions that will come out of a car thanks to an electric car. It's declining from roughly 90 or 100 grams per mile in 2020, which is only about a third of what you get from an internal combustion engine. That's what's important to understand, is the electric car, the same electric car will be responsible for emissions that are closer to about 25 grams per mile in just 10 years, because the grid's getting cleaner and cleaner. Whereas if you were to buy a regular car that runs on gasoline, the emissions are going to be the same for the life of the car. And so that's why we're trying to get people to shift into electric cars as quickly as possible. But according to the new, the governor has a plan to increase the clean energy standard from what it is now to make it be 60% by 2030. And at that rate, then if it will continue, we'll get to roughly zero emissions for electricity and therefore electric cars by about 2050. But I want to congratulate Waltham. Waltham has decided to do what we call green municipal aggregation. We actually feel like we pioneered the model, which is a community can choose an electricity supplier other than Eversource to meet its electricity needs, and usually can get a good deal and get a better rate for the customers, but also can have a greener portfolio, get more renewable energy than required by the state law. So Eversource is restricted by state law. It can only have so much renewable energy in basic service. But starting next month, folks in Waltham will be able to get electricity that is substantially cleaner. And so there's the orange line. And as you can see, you'll be about 10 years ahead of the rest of Massachusetts. You'll be able to have zero emission electricity, not by 2050, but by about 2040. And you can see the trajectory of it building up already within the next 10 years. You'll be driving an electric car, if you have one, in about a month when the new contract for your aggregation comes in. You'll be substantially less than everybody else in the state, and you'll be that way for a long time. And so we congratulate Waltham. We're helping to provide that incremental 10% of renewable energy. We're buying wind and solar power from generators wholesale, and we're selling it retail to Waltham. And we're very pleased to be part of that with a company called Good Energy is the consultant, and Direct Energy will be the electricity supplier serving the town. So if you're watching this and you're a Waltham resident, you should have already received a letter over a month ago saying that you are in the program, but you have the opportunity to opt out if you want to. You can go to this website, waltham-cea.com, to learn more. But this graph just sort of shows you Eversource will continue to have the wires and the poles. They'll send you the bill, actually, and they'll meter your electricity consumption. You'll still get your energy efficiency, your mass save service from them. But now this other company called Direct Energy is going to be your supplier, and you'll get one bill, I believe, starting in June. It'll say Direct Energy on that bill. And so if you look at the resources, what we're going to do is help add more wind and solar to that picture for you. 10% more than required by law, which is pretty significant because the current law is only at 20%. You're boosting it up by a third as a result of the local decision that you've all made. So Waltham, you're part of a movement in Massachusetts that's incredible. There are over 50 communities that are doing this right now. And we estimate by the end of 2021 or maybe 2022, that this model that we call green municipal aggregation is a form of voluntary demand, because if you don't want to be in this program, you can get out at any point and go to a different supplier, Eversource or somebody else. It'll be responsible for maybe 1 million megawatt hours per year, which is the equivalent of 200 large-scale wind turbines that would be the result of the action of people in communities all across Massachusetts. And it's a movement that's growing, and we're seeing more and more communities do this, but your leadership in Waltham is appreciated. And so I want to come back to the point. Green electricity is needed for more than just light bulbs. We want to get across the point. In order to get to the goals that Massachusetts has to reduce carbon emissions, we not only have to have green electricity for our light bulbs and our computers, we need to get people out of internal combustion engines onto public transit is great. Walking and biking is even better. But there are going to be a lot of cars on the road, and we have to make them, we want people to adopt electric cars. Same thing with heating systems. Now there's technology, high performance, cold climate heat pumps can serve your home. Massachusetts has set a goal of roughly 1 million electric cars and 1 million heat pumps by 2030. And we are nowhere close in those. And it's going to add about 100,000 of each year for the next 10 years. And so we've got a lot of work to do. I know Paula said that's going to involve everybody. As Jenny said, it's not just involving the utilities. It's not just involving government. It's going to be a people-centered approach, because we have to explain to individual people have to make the choice. We have to make sure that it makes sense for them in order to reduce the emissions. But the key point I want to make is we can do this. The electricity is available. We can green it up. And for those of us who have electric cars, we can tell you how cool they are, how wonderful they are. And I bet you I paid less for my electric car than most of you have for your internal combustion engine car. So we're there. We just have to keep moving at it. If you have questions, you can email me at larry@greenenergyconsumers.org, and I'm happy to answer questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights and your expertise in this area. We do have some questions, which I will read to you. And I would just say, whoever feels like they are most able to answer, jump in. And if someone wants to add, that's great too. So one question is, please acquaint us with the concept of our carbon budget. This question came in during Paula's presentation. I don't know if you feel like you can speak to it, Paula.
I think Jenny was about to. I can
go, but you can too, if you want to.
I can start by saying that a carbon budget is the amount of carbon dioxide emissions permitted over a period of time to make sure that we stay within a certain temperature threshold. So that's the concept of carbon budget. Jenny, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I would just add that, there's a lot of different ways to quantify what's happening and what needs to happen, and these different measures of, what degree temperature do we want to prevent going above, and then equating that to how much carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents do we want to be emitting. So they're all different measures of keeping track and monitoring and assessing the changes that we're making, or the lack of changes that we're making if the emissions are continuing to go up. So the idea of a carbon budget is to constrain, and so you can personally have your own carbon budget, your city or town could have a carbon budget, your state or country could have a carbon budget. It's kind of like your organization could have a carbon budget, like planning for what you're striving for and how to make changes within a certain constraint of limiting the carbon emissions. So that's the idea, is a framework within which to constrain and guide your decision making so that you stay within certain goals that can be, as Paula mentioned, can be connected right back to global goals for climate.
Okay, great. Thank you. This person says, Jenny said zero emission energy by 2050. And Paula said net zero. And this person worries that net zero involves some sleight of hand with lots of emissions, but maybe capturing them, and wants to know what's the difference between zero emission and net zero.
My dog is barking, so if you want to go first.
Sure, I'll go first. This is, again, these are different mechanisms for accounting and framing the goals, and so it's kind of related to the prior question as well. But there is a distinction here. So zero emissions is stop emitting, right? And so we need to end fossil fuel reliance and burning of fossil fuels, because that's the primary, not the only, but one of the primary emissions. So that's what zero emissions. Net zero is, as the question, the person who posed the question, is more about, when we talk about net, we're talking about both the sources and then also sinks of carbon or of emissions. So that's where it opens up the possibility for offsets, like, oh, well, I'm going to still emit over here, but then I'm going to pay for someone else or some other to not emit over there. So therefore you could say that's net zero. Or another example is, as also someone, I think the question mentioned, that you can still emit, but then if there's some way to suck it out of the atmosphere, then that's another way to say that that's net zero. So they're very different concepts, and it's important to pay attention to the way they're used, right? Because they're actually quite different and open up different priorities and possibilities.
Right.
I would just add, that's why our organization, and I know that Jenny and Paula feel the same way, is so important in the next, say, 10 years. We're really focused on this decade, where everyone should be focused on reducing emissions and at least putting off that what could be pie in the sky concepts of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so in Massachusetts, a lot of us said, well, there should be no netting out until maybe close to 2050. But for the next 10 years in Massachusetts, we have to reduce emissions by 50%. And that's what's key. So the only way to get to that goal is to stop the burning of fossil fuels is what we're all about. And we think if we do a good job, we'll learn more things. By 2030, there will be new opportunities, and we'll figure out how to get to the rest of the way.
Yeah, there was a Globe op-ed recently about, we still need to do the research on what we can do down the road, because that capacity is there. Okay, this person asks, why is the amount of renewable energy provided restricted by Eversource?
So in Massachusetts, many years ago, Massachusetts adopted a law called the Renewable Portfolio Standard that said that anybody selling electricity in Massachusetts had to have, if you're in the business, you're a company, you had to have a certain amount of qualifying renewable resources like wind and solar, certain amounts of types of hydro, anaerobic digestion like cow power or things like that. And that is regulated. That amount, that percentage is great. We have one of the better laws in the country. Many states have renewable portfolio standards, but what we've said is it doesn't move fast enough. Every year they add more renewable energy by law according to the standard. So this year, Eversource has more renewable energy in its portfolio than it did last year. And next year it will have to add more, which is wonderful. But it doesn't go fast enough in order to accomplish our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so it's not necessarily Eversource's fault, although we wish they would support the law more than they do. But that is why we need we need to increase the standard. First of all, that's the most important thing. The law that was just passed helps to do that by a lot. The governor's plan has some good elements to it. But that's why the Waltham aggregation program is so good, is because you're going beyond the state law, because the state law is not going fast enough. So now that you're doing the law aggregation in Waltham, great, but we're still not going fast enough. We do need to speed up the amount of renewable energy we get into the mix.
And Larry, just let me know if I am correct on this, but Jenny, I do believe that Eversource can go farther away. It's the targets that we're talking about is the minimum that they need to fulfill by a certain year. But if the utility company wants to do more, they're free to do so.
I don't think that they can or certainly would. I think there would be concern. I don't think the Department of Public Utilities would go for that. But maybe you're right. I've never seen the utilities propose that, because there are options. There are ways consumers can get electricity, like through aggregation, alternative to Eversource. So I don't think we can, certainly, even if you're right, I don't think we can count on Eversource for putting in more renewable energy than the current minimum.
Yeah, that's a different thing. As you say, the utilities have not been very friendly with this energy transition.
No, a good report came out of Brown University saying the utilities are, constantly trying to get us to go a bit slower, more deliberately. There's no time for that, right?
Right. Okay. Are subsidies discussed regarding switching to efficient heat pumps? And how will people afford that? So are there subsidies baked into the new Massachusetts law to help promote the switch to heat pumps?
Paula, do you want to take that, or I will, whichever?
I will start by saying that the law is including a key provision that requires MassSave, which is the agency that works on the energy efficiency program for Massachusetts, and the Department of Public Utilities to include emissions as decreasing emissions as one of the priorities for their work, which is huge because it means that, for instance, MassSave, when they are thinking about incentives, they should, if let's say that I need to change how heat is produced in my house. Instead of saying, oh, okay, so change to this more efficient gas fuel furnace, why not to use better something that is powered with electricity? This is the kind of changes that we are going to be seeing. But that needs to be, that's when I was saying, we now need to move from the law, which is a huge achievement, to the implementation of the law. And that's the part when the incentive comes into place. What's the incentive that the agency is going to put in place to make sure that we prioritize things that doesn't perpetuate the use of fossil fuels?
That's the kind of civics lesson that I try to talk about. Very important. The legislature didn't prescribe very specific details on exactly how the governor and all of his administration are going to have to work on this. They said that the emissions from buildings will have to go down, as Paula said, but now we have to kind of wait and see. In my organization, and probably the Union of Concerned Scientists is going to be watching for that. Now it goes from the legislative branch to the executive branch, and I know that the governor's office is going to be forming a commission on clean heat that's going to try to lay out a plan for this. But undoubtedly, it's going to require more incentives to get people to do heat pumps. There are incentives right now. If you go to the website for MassSave, you'll see those incentives as a Waltham customer. But we know we've tried to get people of our membership into heat pumps. It's a chore, and to learn about the heat pumps, and the upfront cost is significant. And so the incentives will have to be changed in order to make the 1 million by 2030.
And I just wanted to add a sort of related but different question associated with subsidies. The person asked about subsidies for heat pumps, but another thing to consider, and this is where our policies promoting new technologies are great, and we have to be very cognizant of the policies that are in place that are resisting the transition, making it hard for people to make these choices. And so, and that includes all the subsidies that are in place to perpetuate and continue the fossil fuel use that we all rely on. And so I think this is where, there's been some really good research on the scale of subsidies for fossil fuels that we don't even know. Like, it's become so normal that we don't even consider it, and it's just kind of baked into a lot of our decision making about how far we travel and how we get around and how we heat our homes and how much space we use and how big our homes are, even, right? Like, we're accustomed to this low cost fossil fuel energy. And this other piece about having actually, holding ourselves and our systems accountable and thinking about reducing those fossil fuel subsidies so that the renewable and these alternatives are actually the cost-effective choice, right? And I think that's where I think we also need to be cognizant of how it's not all about choice. Many of us don't actually have that many choices, right? Like we're actually been limited to what we can do and what options we have, especially, I mean, some well-off people have more choice, right? Like, and so a lot of the rich guys can have a lot of the fancy, demonstrate these technologies and point out how great they are. But until we get to, and we're getting closer to it, a point where it's cheaper and easier, right? To have an electric car or take the bus or the electric transit in other ways, or and the heat, how we heat our homes, right? It's still, even if you want to put solar panels or you want to do any of these innovative things, it's not the easiest thing. If you just call the first person and say, this is what I need heat, they'll come to you with more conventional, or I just had to replace my hot water heater. And I said, I want electric hot water heater instead of a gas one. And it was like a big rigmarole. And I was like the awkward customer, because most of the time they just come in and replace the gas hot water heater, right? Like you have to, it's not easy to do these little steps. And so we need to get to the place where it's easier for folks and it's cheaper, because ultimately we're getting closer, right? We really are getting closer to having it make sense for people, but we're still not there where it's in the mainstream. And partly that legitimately is partly due to resistance from the fossil fuel interests who actually don't want us to end our fossil fuel reliance. So we also have to be cognizant of that and integrate that into our decision making when we can. But obviously there are a lot of situations where we don't have choices, and it's hard, or it's hard to make a difficult, they don't make it easy, I guess.
Another cool part of the law is it's going to set aside $15 million a year into workforce development. Because what we've learned is if you want to get, say, 3 bids, you should always get, on anything expensive, you should always get 3 bids. And if you want 3 bids for heat pumps, it's not easy. And the installers are pretty busy. The demand right now for heat pumps is growing faster than the supply. So what we need to do is to get more people into the jobs of installing high efficiency, carbon friendly heating systems. And so that's going to take some work, but it's a good opportunity for people.
And the other thing that is very important also to take into account, and I think is directly connected to what Jenny was talking about costs, and is that when we are designing subsidies, it's not that we are all the same. We need to take into account like the income level of people when designing those kind of subsidies, because it's not the same that a mid-income household pay for a heat pump that a low-income household pay for the same heat pump. Low-income people currently have to pay much more of their income for electricity bills. We need to address that situation so the benefits of this clean energy transition reach everyone.
And I will just mention, just last week or the week before, there was a new Green New Deal resolution proposed, Green New Deal for Cities Act of 2021, which was Cory Bush and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They proposing $1 trillion going directly to cities and tribes. So for municipal and regional governments to be able to invest in the ways that's appropriate for those communities or those cities, right? And it also includes local hiring, so the jobs, including making sure that the jobs are there, and also acknowledging reparations, which means investing in people and communities, particularly those who've been underinvested in, and legacy issues that need to actually be revisited and deserve more investment, right? And so that there are some additional progressive proposals coming through to think about these issues on the local level, and actually giving some of the budget directly to the cities and towns and tribes.
I'm mindful of the time, and we also have a couple more questions. Actually, one of the questions was answered by another viewer. Someone was asking if the 10% renewable was the only tier that the Waltham Community Choice Aggregation offered. And someone answered that you also have the option to go up to 50% or 100%.
Thank you for, I should have said that. And what we're finding in a lot of communities that we work with who do aggregation, the number of people who are going up to 50 or 100% is growing, and it's pretty big. It's actually surprising us. We had to adjust our planning, and that's how we change the world, is by people confounding the expectations. And so if this is one of those things, you know, the field of dreams, if they build it, they'll come. It's sort of the opposite. If you want it, if you show us the demand for renewable energy, there will be people who will build wind turbines and solar panels. And so if you go to that website, waltham-cea.com, you can opt up. We call it, you can go to 50 or go to 100 if you want to.
Yeah. And I was just going to mention that Bill McKibben just wrote his piece in the New Yorker, just came out today, about how ridiculously cheap renewable energy is getting. So, I mean, we're at this inflection point where it's really, there's a lot of potential for really scaling it up and for all of us. So it's exciting time.
Yep.
I think we only have time for one more question, and you guys got to be brief. Now that Waltham has adopted community electricity, which next steps should we take locally to cut carbon emissions?
Ladies, you want to go first?
Go ahead, Larry.
Well, I think the next best thing is to look at your community's transportation network. As Waltham, you know, bang on the MBTA, make every damn bus electric as fast as you possibly can. And school buses, if Waltham has school buses, whether the city owns or leases the school buses, you have control. Kids should not be near a dirty diesel school bus. But also anything else you can to encourage walking and biking within the community. And we can help you organize. We have a buyers group for electric cars, to put that on the table. We call it a program called Drive Green. And but just encourage the adoption of electric cars and heat pumps. But the control you most have is on public transportation.
Yeah, I guess I would, if I was to respond, I would give a zooming out answer, which is not specific to Waltham, but just be engaged civically, right? And not just on climate and energy issues, because it's all connected, right? So we need to have better educational systems, workforce training, jobs, healthcare, you know, transportation and housing issues. Like, it's all interconnected. And so I think just seeing these connections and getting involved locally and regionally and at the state level, at all different levels, whichever works best for you, I think is really important.
And at household level, if you have not had an energy assessment from MassSave, do it ASAP, because it's very important. It's going to save you money, and it's going to help in reducing the amount of electricity that the state needs to produce.
Excellent. And I just want to echo something that Jenny said earlier, which is the climate crisis is an opportunity. And I think if we see it that way and behave that way, we will get there. So thank you all for tuning in tonight. This was a fantastic discussion, and we had some great questions and really excellent panelists. So I thank you all for your time. And I'm going to end this. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.